Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to you all. This is our regular standard South Asia seminar on Friday afternoon. Many of you spend your Friday afternoons with us. I'm Ashutosh Varshne, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Tarun Khanna and his team to Brown. Tarun is a friend, and we've also co-authored an article together, which we publish in Economic and Political Weekly on caste and entrepreneurship in India. But that's not the topic today. He is the Jorge Paulo Lemann Professor, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, at the Harvard Business School, where he's taught since 1993 after getting his bachelor's degree at Princeton and his PhD from Harvard. And a lot of his professional energy, at least since I've known him over the last 10, 12 years or so, has been focused on India, China, and emerging markets. But more importantly for us today, for the last 7 odd years, he's been directing the South Asia Institute at Harvard, recently renamed as Lakshmi Mittal South Asia Institute. Actually, 2 days ago, I think the renaming took place. And under his leadership, the world has come to know two huge projects quite well. One is the project on Kumbh Mela, which has led to some publications, widely noted publications. And the second is the project on partition, which has been going on for some time and which will also lead to, I predict, widely noted publications before long. And he will be giving us a sense of what the project on partition at South Asia Institute, at Lakshmi Mittal South Asia Institute is all about. And will speak for about 45 minutes and might invite his team also to participate. That decision is his. And then I have invited Rehan Jamil, who is a PhD candidate here in political science, and came to us from Columbia with a degree from SIPA, and was educated before that in Karachi and Oberlin College, and has a research interest on historic origins of state capacity in India and Pakistan. And the second commentator will be Aarti Sethi, who received her doctorate yesterday or day before, so which is from Columbia in anthropology, and she is a postdoc scholar here at the Watson Institute, and has published on and has ongoing interests in South Asian visual and media cultures and urban history. Has also a prior degree in political science from Delhi University, and is a founding member of Kafila.org. It's an online, leading online website for discussion of politics and culture, where I've been frequently criticized. That's all right.
Soundly criticized.
Roundly criticized for my writings, especially my columns in Indian Express. And that's the reason I invited her, actually, to come.
And why I accepted with alacrity.
So without any further delay, let's hear Tarun on his partition project and his role therein, and his partner is Kareem Lakhani, who also teaches, if I recall correctly, at the Harvard Business School. So Tarun.
Good afternoon. My colleagues are here. They are doing a lot of work on the partition project. Rasim, Saba, Shubangi, and it's part of a very large team that's working on this. And in a sense, the highlight of the institute that I've built and run is that it's very collaborative and open, and we take on things that typically fall under the cracks and can, I think, only be done well if there's a lot of disciplines coming together. So the Kumbh Mela that Ashu referred to was such a project, one that I'm proud to have been associated with. It was not led by me. It was led by the institute, but there were other faculty leading it. Nor is this particular project led by me. The genesis of this is really work that a doctor and human rights activist, Jennifer Leaning, has been doing in Pakistan for the last 10 years, trying to understand the humanitarian aspects of the partition of British India. And it's really Jennifer's seminal work that, but what I'm good at is spotting the proverbial $20 bill lying on the sidewalk. And when I saw this effort, I said, this is something that we can certainly grow. And I'll tell you a little bit about it in addition to this piece of the project. Kareem is I'm a mathematician by training. I'm a masquerading humanist or social scientist. And so is Kareem. So like any human being, I mean, we have a bag of tricks. And when you have a hammer, you look for a nail. So I looked at the partition. I said, this looks like a nail to me. I'm going to hit it with my math tools and see what happens. And so that's my defense for anything absurd that I say up front. Okay, so my team loves pictures. So Aarti, do you want to sit there? Is it easier for you? You can if you want. Yeah, it's might be better.
I don't know why I didn't.
Just some pictures to get us started. We don't have very much time, so I'll just kind of zip through this. Partition of Ireland back in the 20s, Palestine. So you can see from these that these are legacies that stay with us. The Cyprus dispute still. So this is a commonplace occurrence. You can see it. I wouldn't call Catalonia a partition, but it's you see these separations and partitions all the time. And the intent that I wanted to just signal with these pictures. So I gave this talk at the World Economic Forum a few weeks ago and in some academic seminars, and not everybody is steeped in what partition is or what it is. So these pictures are meant to be suggestive of the idea that this is a phenomenon that vastly predates the 1947 episode or the 1971 episode in South Asia, and probably will continue to occur in a variety of different senses as different polities and people reconsider their affiliations in different ways for endogenous or exogenous circumstances. The other aspect, of course, is the migration aspect, right, which again has been in the news a lot with the Rohingyas. Some of the columns in the New York Times have been especially horrific on this. And this is what Jennifer, the doctor I was saying about her work, is about. Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, etc. And that brings us to the partition of British India, which I think is, at least as best as we've been able to say, the largest recently recorded forced migration in history, and probably deserving of more study. The one thing that I have become convinced by in the 9-12 months that I've immersed myself in this, trying to educate myself beyond the anecdotal or very one-sided historical view that I imbibed as a student in Delhi, Punjab, Bombay, etc., Indian Punjab, growing up, is that this is a phenomenon with many facets, and it's a little bit like the proverbial elephant and the blind man, and you see a piece of it, and there's lots of other facets that are not quite clear to you. So I'm more and more convinced that this is something that we need to open up the scholarly inquiry box to, and that we are now in a position to do, and that's what we hope at our institute to try to do. Virtually every family from the northern part of the subcontinent will have experienced something to do with the partition, either on the Bengal side or the Punjab side. Certainly true of both my parents and their respective families, coming from Lahore into Delhi. But these pictures are commonplace to us at the dinner table for the last. I'm 50 years old, 51 years old, and for 50 years I've been seeing pictures like this and reconstructing these stories or repressing them in different ways. This is a little bit of a heat map for those of you. This is a South Asia seminar, so probably everybody's familiar with this, but just in case, a map that's a little bit of a heat map of migration Think, 15 to 20 million people moving, both sides, both ways. This is not a one-directional movement. You can see considerable amount of movement on the Punjab border and less on this border. I think this migration is this migration only 47, 17.9? Yeah, this is just 47. So this doesn't, so for those who are not informed, the main partition that I'm going to be talking about is 1947. There is a subsequent splitting of what was then West and East Pakistan, with East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh. And here it's referred to as East Pakistan because we're talking about 1947. At that time, that's what it was. Wonderful scholar Urvashi Butalia, who has done a lot of interviews, and really the one thing I take away from her book, the one book that I read, she's written 2 or 3 of them, is that the residual legacy of partition is very real. And as you can see the extracts that we put up here. The bitterness remains on both sides of the border, and is the source of a lot of the tension that still exists in the subcontinent. And I remember I came to this country in 1984. It was just a few months before the massacre of the Sikhs in Delhi in the wake of the assassination of Indira Gandhi. And that is very vivid in my mind. It's imprinted in my memory because my entire family lives in Delhi. And but here again, I think the relevant piece is that people, as the violence was being perpetrated on the Sikhs in Delhi, people referred to it as unfinished business. Even though largely the Sikhs were siding with the Hindus, and this is sort of Hindu and Sikh violence for the most part, as best as I understand it. So there is a residue of this that is troubling. The overall project, as I said, tries to bring together. Oh, there's a mic here. I have to say here. Tries to bring together different pieces. What Jennifer and I did as kind of co-leaders of this project is we ran an open evening seminar over 8 weeks when we invited one expert to come in and speak about his or her research in the seminar. So you can see that there's a little bit of the historical background, issues of gender, issues of nascent nationalism and how they were stirred up and nurtured. The crowdsourcing piece, which is one of these 8 sessions that I'll talk more about in a moment. A lady who specializes in the role of cartography, both as cause and consequence of the partition. Wonderful scholarship from, I forget where she was from, I think Colorado. Personal witness, we have a faculty member at the Kennedy School, Harvard Kennedy School, Marty Chen, who is the daughter of missionaries and lived through both 1947 and 1971 personally. That, to my mind, was the most vivid of the 8 seminars, because she shared personal letters that her brother and her mother wrote in real time in the partition. So that's a rare thing that we were able to get that. And then just sort of a summary session. But the way these projects work is each of these things has its own life, and people are pursuing different aspects. Currently, we have Jennifer's work on the humanitarian consequences. We have this analytic crowdsourcing piece that I'm going to talk about in a moment. We have an architecture piece, which is to basically suggest that the migratory flows in both directions left their fingerprints on the urban topography of modern Pakistan, modern India, right? So, simple example, in my hometown in Delhi today is most of South Delhi would not have developed the way it has if it weren't for particular migrant communities coming and settling in all sorts of places, Faridabad and Gurgaon and whatever else and so on. And so we have somebody studying the urban residue, if you will, the fingerprints on the urban topography of migration flows in both directions. It's a very interesting project. I know there are some others. And then we've got a team of almost 30, 40, 50 academics in Lahore, in Karachi, in Dhaka, in Delhi, Bombay, who are pursuing their own research within this umbrella and sharing, and we've got these protocols set up for us to share primary documents and so on. The reason I'm saying this is I think that it's an underused method, if you will, in the social sciences and humanities when we all go off and write our books, right? I'm not a book writing type, so I don't think that way, but I notice that it's the dominant way of doing things. Nothing wrong with that. These people will all go write their books, but there is this sharing aspect that we've been able to, I think, demonstrate is very productive. So that's the background. What is the aim? Prerna's parents were just saying that one of their parents is 94, 96, God bless. And so the motivation for us was that, the generation that lived through partition, this is 70 years ago now, and that has some living memory, must at least have been 5-10 years old at the time they experienced it, right? So they would be between 75 to 95, something like that, right? And they're not going to be with us very much more in an actuarial sense, and so it would be nice to capture their memories. Now, this blazingly novel insight is not novel to us, right? There's tons and tons of people running around saying we want to crowdsource this stuff. And our intent, or my intent, is not to one-up these efforts. There's one in Amritsar, there's been a long-standing effort in Berkeley. There are at least 5 that I know on the East Coast. There's another 3 in Pakistan. There's a Citizens Archive of Pakistan. There's a virtual museum in Dhaka, and I'm sure there are 100 more that I don't know of. Ashish Nandi's very long-standing project. So there are a lot of these. Rather, what we are trying to do here is to amass a critical mass of these interviews, invite others to participate in it, contribute to it if they wish, use our interviews within the constraints and ethical and legal protocols that we have to still identify and set up, and demonstrate that there are some analytic things that we can do with it. And so ideally, we would do it on the entire mass of things. So it's very much a positive sum thing, I hope. Sadly, what we discovered was that the minute we said we're going to do this, we were semi-attacked by everybody saying, oh, it's Harvard muscling in and trying to do it. We've been doing it for a long time. That's anything but the intent. It's just to collect enough so that we can do the analysis and show it and then make it open to others. So whether that's realized or not, I'm pretty much a realist. I'm an idealist, but also a realist, and we'll see if that actually transpires. So Ashish, for instance, would never share anything as a simple example, since you brought it up. So essentially, the primary motivation here is to gather these. And I am influenced by the Shoah Memorial of the Holocaust, which is currently at Spielberg-funded center at University of Southern California. And they've done some amazing work on preserving memory and preserving visual archives and oral archives and so on. But very little analysis connected to it. So not being a historian, I began to read amazing books with titles like What is History? This, of course, is the title of a very famous book by Carr, who was at Cambridge many years ago. I think this book was written in the 1950s and 1960s. And there are basically 2 views. The view that I find closer to my scientist sensibility is the idea that history is no different than any other form of reasoning, that you have a way of thinking about it, and you go and look at data, qualitative, quantitative, and you try to refine your understanding and your hypothesis, and you progressively get persuaded that something that you thought was correct and true, or you get persuaded that you were incorrect and you refine your hypothesis. That's the way all reasoning pursues and goes back to all sorts of grades. And so I wrote here, history and science are interconnected. This is a view that I subscribe to. The object of science and historian studies is the same, to increase our understanding. The alternative view, I gave a talk at the Kennedy School some weeks ago, and there was somebody there who said that actually I prefer to think of the historian as somebody who, rather than seeking to eliminate ambiguity, seeks to revel in it and, I don't know if she said perpetuate, but revel in it and celebrate it and think of multiple possible interpretations flourishing and so on. I don't necessarily see that as inconsistent, potentially, but there is a tension between them in some ways. And of course, related to this is this idea of objectivity and subjectivity, and of course the notion that we all approach this stuff with our own, particularly historical phenomena, which we cannot definitionally relive, but we approach all this with our own biases, and there's no fact independent of the lens through which you're observing that fact. So those views are related and somewhat in tension, I think. That said, so you know, I mean, when you think about the partition, right? I mean, the view that I read as a high school student in India. I had some Pakistani roommates at Princeton, and I remember one of the most shocking revelations to me in freshman year was putting up one of my roommates, Khurram from Karachi, put up a map on the wall, and the map was, of course, very different from the Indian map, and I didn't know that this was true or that was true, and a standard thing that many of us have been through many times, right? But what I was going to say is that the scholarship that we were exposed to is certainly biased through our own particular social, political, partisan lenses in different ways, either explicitly or inadvertently. And then some would say that it's also based on archives and materials and so on that, I don't have a sophisticated way of saying it, but more Britain-friendly than the colonies friendly, so to speak, because they were the people who were in position of preserving things, and that's where the documents are stored. So you don't have to take that literally, but I think it's not hard to see that there must be voices who experienced the partition that have been relatively suppressed or kept to themselves. And the idea here is really to uncover that, to give voice to that unvoiced segment in some ways as much as possible. And I'll come back to that because even within the unvoiced, there are different degrees of extent of being suppressed. And that's an important part of the way that we're going, collecting the data going forward. It's built into the collection process. So in a sense, what we have already, whether it's Urvashi Bhutalia's work or work of other people who worked on partition, is already biased in one direction. So what we're going to do now is contribute a different body of data, and you can interpret it in the fullness of time as just data, or you can take to heart our analyses of it, which have a particular spin. Either way, all this is going to have a different set of biases. So I don't want to pretend that what I'm doing is, you know, the objective truth. It's simply another set of biased observations. But at a minimum, I would say it's differently biased than the stock of stuff that we've been reading, and I think that's important. There's an interesting mathematical problem underlying here, which I'd love to work on, which is when you have one set of biased outcomes and then you bring in another set of biased outcomes, and you don't know the relation between the two biases. What can you say mathematically about the net result? I don't have an answer, but there's a theorem there. Okay, so what are some biases? They're pretty obvious. I went through this. There's some biases in the existing history. Obviously, oral narrative is biased, right? We know this in a very common sense way. There's a very deep psychological and psychiatric literature that goes into all this stuff, talks about real and false memories, hard to distinguish between them. Memories change over time, et cetera. And then there's specific biases related to trauma. And here the literature in psychology is quite conflicted. There's a body of work, an experimental work that says trauma tends to be wiped out from memory, and so you don't remember the most traumatic things. That's your way of dealing with it. There's another set of work that says trauma is imprinting and cannot be shaken away. It's just sitting there and just needs to be re-triggered and will come up in different ways. I don't know what to do with these observations as yet. It's something to keep in mind as we kind of go through it. Okay, closer look of the pitfalls of memory, age, already talked about these things, and this issue of memory recall. Maybe the act of actually crowdsourcing somebody's memory or sourcing somebody's memory is enough to trigger a memory. And we find that in some of the data that we show. And there's an interesting issue of whether you want to construct the data set based on what I'll call unaided recall. In other words, just ask people, what do you remember? Or whether you want to prompt it as time goes on, because they end up yielding quite different data sets. So we have to be, and there are pros and cons to all this. There's also an ethical issue here, which is if somebody has suppressed it, and that's the way they deal with it, do I really want Rasim showing up and shaking that poor old man and saying, remember your trauma? That doesn't seem the most kind thing to do. all the time. So there's that issue also. I'm just raising questions that as will be obvious to you, we're pretty early in this research. We've been going for 8-9 months, and we've just essentially done a pilot of about 400, 500 of these interviews and coded them and analyzed them. And we're working our way up to several thousand. But we certainly haven't completed the data collection even. I like this quote. It's a little bit wordy, but memory needs to be analyzed in conjunction with its opposite, forgetting. History is always in tension between memory and forgetting. It depends on the first, on memory, and is an antidote to the second. It's well said. I talked about this. There's a tension between I talked about this, which is how do you deal with the subject who has undergone some form of traumatic experience, and what is our sort of ethical responsibility as researchers? Ultimately, the fact that I'm doing this with Kareem should indicate that we obviously think that the benefits of preserving the record and correcting the past biases outweighs the ethical costs of this. But that's not an analytic statement. That's just a statement, a gut statement. I should also say there's, as in any research design, there are many choices that the researcher makes, and there's a bunch of choices we've made here that are questionable. So I want to highlight a couple of those. One, we're going to be approaching it with our statisticians, mathematicians toolkit, and looking for patterns, which are by their nature patterns of aggregation, and therefore we're obscuring individual things. But I'll go back to two aims of this crowdsourcing project. One is to source the data and make that available to any researcher. I always say that in a way that makes it sound like it's really open, but like the Shoah, it's not really open. You have to respect all sorts of safeguards to get to the data. So there's the data aspect, and then there's our analysis, which is inevitably a parochial and particular analysis, but hopefully both those will have some value. You could imagine another version, which is you simply make the oral archives available and you let people go in and manipulate the data and code it in their own way, as opposed to using our coding of the data, and they might come up with something completely different. So those are some choices that we have made. So I'm going to switch now into talking about what we actually did very quickly. I'm going to show you some patterns based on 430 oral stories. Each of these stories are, think, an hour long of somebody talking to somebody else. But the model that we followed is what we call the ambassador model. Right? The ambassador model is essentially a group of, think of them as young college graduates in all over Pakistan and India, some in Bangladesh, not very many yet, some in Cambridge here, some in the UK, who are basically going out and talking to as diverse people as fall within their penumbra of influence, right? There's a sampling problem here, and there's again a mathematics of sampling that I'm not going to go into today, and I can't with only 400. But essentially, that's the model that we were trying to pilot and see how it works.
There was a time.
Okay, might as well play that. How do I do it? But these are actual voices of, so each of these interviews is recorded. So I'm going to just play a minute of actual sound, and I think it makes a difference to hear it.
So there was a time that in our house there were 40 families.
They had adopted a Muslim boy who was an orphan. That boy had grown up in our grandparents' home.
15th August 1947, that night was a crucial night.
We remained there for some time, then the tenth murder was there. We got in touch with him, that we kya kare? He said, "Aapko rehna padega, you have no clue."
No affliction, no differences. Hindus went to Muslims, Muslim came to Hindu houses.
We could never imagine कि हम engineering college में चले जाएंगे या कहीं degree मिल जाएगी. And so things happened.
India has been ruled by British for hundreds of years. And throughout those years, the country yearned for independence.
ये जो पॉपुलेशन की इधर से उधर से इधर खून खराबा ये वो ये नहीं होता.
That was a general notion. Whenever the partition is declared, say independence is declared in 15th August 1947, this riot will subside, and after 2-3 months we'll come back and earlier state of control.
And there was a feeling of nation building, which is gone now. Families used to raise their own families. Whoever comes, come live with us. There was big heart, large hearts. Live with us. And I remember even non-related people living together.
And in Delhi we stayed in Kingsley camp in tents. Half the tents were with our families of 12 persons and half the tent was with other person.
You know, in the years leading up or just prior to the partition, there was no hostility.
And we had a great life, that's all, and all of us, friends, this and that, singing on the beach, talking late at night, even though our parents are calling us to get back in, we all.
History is not something that, contrary to, what it should be, it's never forgotten. It's never forgotten.
So it gives you a little bit of flavor. So what we have is, 500-600 hours of basically not even semi-structured, unstructured recollection on the part of people who lived through the partition. And the spirit of the rest of what I'm going to do is I'm going to torture the data and convert it into some numbers, to the horror of many humanists and scientists, and torture it until it confesses. But recognizing, of course, that there's a lot more in the data that has not, I think we might have exploited 5% of the information in here, because we don't get to the nuance, the tone, the inflection, the body language, a whole bunch of other stuff. So, but just a word again about the ambassador model. The reason we went with that is that we felt that, and continue to feel that, it's a lot easier to have someone to tell the story to than to ask people simply to record it into a Android phone. That said, we are going to do just talk into a phone and upload your story, and we already have launched that in different places. So that will probably expand the data set dramatically, but only a particular type of person will have access to that, or be felicitous enough to go with it. So this is, and since these are elderly people, for the most part, it's a lot better to have somebody sitting face to face with you and talking to you. The ambassadors have required a lot of hand-holding and training in what's called sort of IRB protocols, which is sort of review boards to make sure whenever you deal with live subjects that you are treating them ethically and fairly and so on, and the data. Then there's a whole bunch of data sanctity and data security protocols, training for how to deal with difficult situations, et cetera, et cetera. So we had a lot of hand-holding to produce these ambassadors. And the ambassadors are all voluntary. They're not paid anything. They're just college kids, graduates all over. We put out a call, we interview them, we train them, and then we use them as much as they consent to being used. And that's the model that we're going to scale up, in addition to this speak into a phone model, and we'll see what that yields over time. So that's a data collection method. The pilot is just 400. It's mostly people in India. There are 50 from Pakistan, 23 from the Dhaka area, and negligible from here. And the only reason for this disparity is that our Pakistan team has been slower to get started, but now it's up and running. So going forward, we'll have probably more comparable numbers. Okay. One interesting thing is the migration route, and of course we always hear about, Delhi-Lahore axis or Karachi-Mumbai axis both ways. Those are well studied, well documented, but of course actual migrations were all over, and we try from the conversations to reconstruct the migration paths of people, and that's something that in large sample we can do a lot more with. Sorry, the first image was. It's not showing properly. Okay. So the sort of clean lines are normally studied, and these are the actual migration paths. Some of them are. So you can do things like, where did you stop on the way? what refugee camp, do you remember anything about the refugee camp? How long did you stay there? Why did you stay there? What did you see along the way? Who helped you? Who didn't help you? There's copious detail in the actual 600 odd hours of narrative, even from this. So we can certainly do things like locate refugee camps that don't seem to be recorded anywhere, at least prominently. We could even, in principle, go apropos the urban fingerprints of the migration patterns. We can go to the places in India and Pakistan and see what happened to those sites. And in some cases, you can still see the residue of the refugee camp. In other cases, it's been absorbed. I don't even know what we could do with these data, but probably there's a lot, depending on the research question that somebody wants to ask. But one piece of it certainly is reconstructing the paths and how long people took and why they went in particular ways. And it seems to me that these sorts of, and these are of course all involuntary migrations, right? So it seems to me that there should be some learning here eventually for a lot of the forced migration that you see played out now on the front pages of the press. Average age of people in these 400 samples about 13 years at the time of, so 13 plus 70, they'd be 83 years old, the average age of the person in this data set. 92% of the people we talked to migrated, and 44 of that 92 stayed in camps along the way, and I'll say more about it. It's just one interesting statistic. A fourth women, and since it's more the data collection has been more India-centric so far, you can see the religious split here with the 10% Sikh population in there. It's just to give you a flavor of the and all possible languages, right? Unsurprisingly, because people, when they're recounting, they'll revert to their mother tongue.
30% listed English as their first language.
Well, they spoke in English.
They spoke.
Yeah, they spoke in English. Nobody will say English is their first language, right? But they chose to speak in English. You could hear some of them on the. My father's voice is in that voice, and he would, if you ask him what's your mother tongue, he'll say Punjabi, because that's what we speak at home. But he spoke in English, maybe because some fancy Harvard person showed up, so he spoke in English. I don't know, no idea. So what do? We actually use only the text spoken by the interviewee and not interruption by the interviewer. We use transcripts. So this is an important limitation, which is how much time do I have, Asha?
10 minutes.
Okay. It's an important limitation. Our analysis is based on the English transcripts, right? So we're translating. So if somebody translated poorly, that's not good. But since we're mostly working with facts, it should be okay at this point anyway. We don't incorporate video or oral cues. We don't incorporate emotion. Don't do anything with nonverbal data. Some people get very agitated in the course of the interview. Some people are resigned and calm. Some people break down. We don't use any of that information. That's information. Absolutely relevant information. We don't use it. By the way, there are a lot of techniques to do this. There's speech recognition techniques that I've used myself in other contexts that are available to use. And some of our interviews have other people present while the interviews are conducted, and that could be good or bad. One of the things that our ambassadors had noticed was that very often the women would not speak, and would not speak. That's probably not the right way to say it. Some man would take over the conversation, the son, the brother, the husband. And we had to then train the IRBs to get rid of the man somehow, politely, so that the woman could speak, and you get that perspective. None of this is surprising, right? I mean, I can see all the ladies laughing, nodding their heads. But since we want the perspective of everybody, we have to find ways to gently suggest that, okay. Okay, so just some summary. So I'm just going to show you some tables now, okay, with the summaries. So when we look at the interview transcripts, we see that a fourth of the people say they experienced violence. Maybe 2/3 say that we experienced a threat of violence as opposed to actual violence. And somebody else says we witnessed persecution on somebody else, not us, right? We have some people who viewed partition as a positive event. So my Pakistani students and colleagues always remind me that for Pakistan, this is the creation of a new country. So it's not necessarily a negative event. For India, it's an unambiguous loss. So Indians will always say it's negative. And a lot of people, so remember, we're not asking people anything. We're just letting them say what they want. And 15% of people express positive statements about another religion. Right? And 20% explicitly express negative sentiments. So this is all the Hindus' fault, or the Hindus did bad things, or vice versa. And most people don't say really anything, don't explicitly comment on it. I'm going to skip that. So Rasim, you want to say, so what is a cluster analysis? Cluster analysis basically is just take the data, so take these 4 dimensions, stayed at a refugee camp, figure out whether you're middle class or above. In other words, you have a person of means or not of means. Did you experience violence? And do you view partition positively or not, right? If you take those 2 variables and you code them across all the 400 interviews, right, you can look at all that data and say, are they naturally occurring clusters of things that you see? That's what a cluster analysis is. So what are the clusters? Just say it in English.
Yeah, so I like how Tarun says we tortured the data, and I promise we're not trying to torture you with all these digits. All this is saying is it's an expression of the data that says that if you see middle class or above, that column, the ones those are the wealthier migrants, and they are viewing the partition negatively if they haven't experienced a threat of violence or stayed at a refugee camp. But the other group, that's cluster 2, they're saying that they view partition positively, or they view partition positively if they haven't experienced those things. And cluster 3 is our group of poor migrants who have experienced much higher levels of threat and much higher levels of staying in refugee camps, and they view the partition more negatively. That's what this cluster analysis is showing.
Okay, so to say it in English, right, restate what Rasim is saying. This cluster, right, this group of whatever number, we don't have the numbers here. How many are in this cluster? We don't know. Okay.
There are 38.
Okay, so this group tend to be poor people who had violence visited upon them and have a negative recollection of the process, right? This group tends to be rich people that also had some violence and views partition negatively, may or may not have stayed in a camp, right? So the idea of this exploratory analysis is to see if there's naturally occurring things. That's basically what it is. My conclusion of this is that it's premature to look for patterns because the data are not really cooperating with 400 points. But if we had 10,000, then you would most likely see much clearer clusters. And I think in time it'll be informative. What is this? So this is so these are all little correlations, right? And basically this says is that both Hindu and Muslim migrants. So one thing that's missing in the data are Muslims in India, right? Of which there are many. That's not something that we tried to have missing. It's just that when our ambassadors went out, they ended up not talking to very many Muslims at all. And the reason that's very important is that obviously this whole event has strong religious angle to it. And comparing the views of Muslims in Pakistan, currently in Pakistan, with the views of Muslims in India would be extremely informative on a variety of dimensions. So that's something that we need to aggressively remedy. And I'll come to that in a second. Generally, migrants who cross the Bengal border have much less violence, and that has to do with, on the Bengal border, migration and movement has occurred over many, many decades, right? Whereas on the Punjab border, it's an epochal event that happens sort of more one shot. This is interesting. So I should say a little bit about this variable middle class or above. In other words, not poor. It's coded by inference. So we read the data. If you talk about yourself as a landed gentry, or you talk about property and assets, or you talk about assets that you lost, we infer that you have some means. And many of the people, and that's the way it's coded. If we can detect assets, then you're middle class or above. And we can do a better job of this over time. And we might be inadvertently calling somebody not middle class when they are actually quite wealthy. It's quite possible. So it's a variable that has noise in it in the statistician lingo. But what's very stark is that the only people who stayed at camps were those who were poor. Right. So the slightly wealthier, or those who had some means, managed to duck the camps. And these are people who generally did not fly. So this seems to exclude mostly the people who were connected or in the civil service or had a slightly greater inkling of what was coming and decided to take off and fly off to some safe place. Doesn't include those. So these are people who all kind of moved, physically moved over land for the most part. And those among them who were better off probably found ways to evade the camps. That turns out to be statistically true. Those who had familial or professional ties to the destination generally had a much smoother experience. One infers because they knew where they were going, and they rather than simply wander around. Unsurprisingly, people who have reported easier journeys are more likely to view the partition as a positive event or a not negative event. People who view the other religion, in other words, not their religion, positively, are more likely to view partition as a negative event. Also kind of makes sense, and it goes both ways actually. Because they would say it would have been nice if we hadn't had the partition, because we have good memories of the other people of the other religion. And this is an interesting analysis that's quite robust. It basically says think of all this as you, in a statistical sense, with 300 observations. What we're basically saying, if you ask people, if you code the interview in an overall, as having an overall, so the way I would code them, I didn't read all the interview transcripts. I read 20 maybe, 25, and then these guys read most of them, and then we had a way to code them. But of those that I read, I would say that they had a flavor of either the interviewee being resigned to partition. Nobody's really happy about partition, but they have the feeling that it happened, it's unfortunate, made peace with my history, I'm going to go forward. That's one characteristic. The other one is venomous and bitter and angry, and that's stayed after 70 years. So let's just say there's two. So if you're in the former set, I'd code it as you have a positive, and otherwise you're negative. And what you basically see is that there's much more anger in Pakistan of people who are currently in Pakistan. There's much more anger of people who are in India, right? Which is the Indians view this as a terrible thing that happened and have made less peace with it, maybe. And the Pakistanis have kind of made peace with it. Yeah.
What is the distribution of the respondents by class and education?
Class, we don't know, right?
No, we don't know class. Class. Oh, class.
Oh, class. So that's, you mean how many are middle class and how many are, you know that's how many?
Not off the top of my head.
So my recollection is about, I would say more than a third is, more than a third is lower class.
So the majority are middle class?
Yeah. Because I think in the initial, let's think about how we collected the data, right? I'm a student, I'm a professor at Harvard, I put out a call and say, who wants to collect data? So it's people in my networks who are going to respond. They tend to be more educated people. So one of the things I want to come to is a very important question. One of the things I want to come to is, which we've implemented, is a protocol for making sure that we get much more hard to access groups of people going forward. So I would take all this with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, this correlation is just surprisingly strong to me, because you can shake it in every way and it works. Okay, what else? I don't need to spend time on this. These are sort of camps that we've identified through the oral stories. Some of these are very well known, others are less well known. You can break it out by city. You can get pictures, you can go back to the archives and figure out exactly what happened. This is that urban topography project. We're toying with the idea, what happened? We're toying with the idea of getting people to upload memorabilia. So this is a tailor who, the thing that he remembers about partition is his scissor. He's got a picture of the scissor that he wants to upload into this. I don't know what we would do with it, but it's another piece of how people remember things in some ways, and I think there's a story there. Okay, these are our current stories. These are our targets by December. You can see the locations and so on where we will collect the data. And in a sense, this is the kind of production timeline of the data. These are sort of events where we've committed to present something, and these are targets for story collection, which are rolling along smartly. And I want to come to this. This is an interesting thing. 3,000 basically split between India, Pakistan, smaller number in Bangladesh, smaller number in US, UK. Then within each, broken down, making sure that at least 40% of these are from women, 30% from so-called minorities. In India, the minorities would be Dalits, and make sure that we have enough from Muslim, Christian, and Sikh communities. The Muslim community is especially important because of comparison, and some rural interviews. And similarly, within Pakistan, you make sure that you have it's a very tiny minority, non-Muslim population. But even within the Muslim population, to get relatively harder to access Ahmadis, Shia population that are harder to get to. Again, in the spirit of saying that we can't really have a random sample, but let's make sure that we are going and getting enough of the, ideally we want a random sample, but we can't have a random sample. The other way we could do it is we could say, and the only reason I would want to do it is that the mathematics of sampling are very clear on this, that I interview you and you refer me to someone else and you refer me to someone else. And it turns out that very quickly you get very close to a random sample if you end up with, say, 5,000 observations. But that's hard to do because it seems to be difficult to have somebody who's 80 years old then say, I know another 80-year-old. It doesn't work. Operationally doesn't work. Okay, different methods. This is sort of a data architecture slide. We've got ambassador models, we've got secondary stories. Individuals who want to tell their story can upload it. This is an interesting one. In Pakistan, we've collaborating with the Citizens Archive, which is again one of these outfits that has already collected, how many stories? 2,500. They already have 2,500 beautifully preserved stories of partition, all from Pakistan to which I'll be done in 2 minutes. So we're going to collaborate with them. So this is a nice example of win-win approach in many ways. In Pakistan, another thing that we're doing is there's something called, what is it called, Fez? Fez Foundation, which of course is the famous Fez, for those of you who know. The idea is that they will use their network and their affiliates to put out a call for interviews for us in Pakistan, and so we will get a lot through them. And similarly, I could imagine just going to, for instance, go to the Jaipur Lit Fest or something, and just put up your booth there, and you'll get tons of people who show up and do it. So there are a variety of ways we could expand this data set in the months to come. Bangladesh is a slower moving entity, but we've just signed some collaborations to begin this process, so hopefully that'll start kicking in. I don't need to go through this, but there's a lot of, the Shoah Foundation, we've learned a lot from it. There is this center that I wasn't aware of, Columbia Center for Oral History Research, that has just a ton of it's the largest collection of oral histories on this, that, and the other, anywhere in the world, 10,000 interviews spanning all sorts of stuff. Here are just a quick and dirty list of, remember how I said everybody and their brother is collecting stories? We've got a ton of these, mostly they don't seem to be doing anything with them. And some of them, like the New York Times, the BBC, I'm sure are just motivated by, it's the 70th anniversary, we should do something. And so they put out a little website and then it'll die out in a few months. Citizens Archive, This is our online app, which is available, so you can simply go on, and if you have a story to tell, or a video or an image to upload, or a sound clip to upload, you can go to our app and upload it, and this has also started now. So when we put this out, I expect we will get thousands and thousands of these coming in from around the world. These are all different analyses that you can do with this. Thank you very much.
Rehan, start with you. Yeah? You want to go there or speak here? Okay. Rehan, Jamil. Thank you. 12 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tarun. This is it's a really, I want to say it's a
crazy project.
I was going to say impressively ambitious, because it's like, this is the seminal event that has shaped the history of modern South Asia. I don't think I'm exaggerating in saying that. Yes. And there's still there's still fundamental, this is 70 years after the partition of the Indian subcontinent. We still, I'm sure you're well aware of this, we still have, all the numbers we have of largest migration in the world at the time, these are estimates we have. The number of fatalities that happened, these are estimates. And from the perspective of social science, which I think there is some interesting work that's happening now that's really trying to demystify those numbers. But I just wanted to, I wanted to start more generally with how we should, the way I think your initial presentation started, how we should just, how we should conceptualize partition. And this is my 2 cents on this that may or may not be useful for your project. And then maybe I have some specific comments for you. But this is, the first thing is this term. I'm really fascinated by this term partition. And it was actually, I come from a partition family myself. I've grown up in Pakistan. You grew up hearing this word. It's central to the nationalist history and the construction of that history. But I've never thought about this word because I've always heard, and actually it's a professor who has, I'm surprised to not see her here, Professor Wazira Zamindar, who's I think probably one of the most important partition historians we're very lucky to have here. But I heard her in Karachi last December speak on Dr. Ambedkar. She gave a presentation on his writings on Pakistan. And she highlighted this point that I thought is very profound. And she's like, the Palestinians remember the forced displacement of Palestinians living in pre-47 Israel as Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. In European history, the genocide of European Jews is remembered as the Holocaust. And we use an administrative term, the partition, which is probably something out of the Radcliffe Award. And the translations in Hindi and Urdu are, in Urdu it's Taqseem-e-Hind or Batwara, it's like almost worse in the vernaculars of our language because it, in a way, it almost, it hides what is like this deep rupture of the social fabric of especially North India's fabric. So that's one thing. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the idea that partition is we think about partition as this singular event or the events around the separation of these two countries at independence. But what I want to suggest and what I think would be really innovative for your project would be to think of partition as this ongoing process that continues to this day. And so what do I mean by that concretely? So you have these, the biggest transfers of population, the biggest migrations. You use the word forced migration. That I think should probably be a question on your survey. It's a deep and interesting question. For whom it was forced, who voluntarily came, on which side, and these are interesting, unresolved or perhaps unresolvable questions. But so the bulk of the population movements happen in 47, but you have people going back and forth between the two countries, and I've been curious about this because I know anecdotally from I come from Karachi, a city where there are many, Karachi in many ways is definitively the partition city because there's so many ties of people across the border. But that back and forth, when that started to sever is a very interesting question, and that's something I would. It's you talked about the mapping the roots of 47. I think that's where your value added. It's this, I would love to see a visualization, not just of the roots, but even post 47. People are coming to Pakistan, family networks. Pakistan needed a bureaucracy. You hear all these stories of how people are coming in the 70s, and even to, it continues even to this day. Many of you might know in Pakistan about, in the recent, with the violence in the federally administered tribal areas, and even from Sindh, you had Hindu minorities from Pakistan going to India and asking for citizenship in India. On the Bangladeshi side, you have Biharis, who these are doubly stateless people, who migrated from Bihar to what was then East Pakistan in 1947, and then after 1971, denied citizenship in Bangladesh, and many informally migrate to Pakistan. There's a direct legacy of that. So, to really think about partition as this ongoing process, I think that's something novel and innovative, and we really need to, that conceptually helps us understand this phenomena much better. We're living in a time, I think it's safe to say, of a kind of toxic nationalism between India and Pakistan. And, I can say personally, I'm the third generation that grew up in Pakistan. My grandparents migrated from North India to Pakistan. My father and mother grew up in post-independent Pakistan, and I grew up in post-71 Pakistan. So my generation, there's a generation below me, has no memory of even East and West Pakistan being together, let alone partition. So really, one of the things, because often you mentioned the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, there are other projects like that. A lot of these projects are fantastic, and I don't want to dismiss them, but they either veer on the side of nostalgia, of people looking back, the generation that we're losing, or a lot of animosity and anger in the range of emotions that it has. But what would be interesting, and even from a method, I'll end on probably I think I wrote down the sample bias here. I don't have to say it is huge from a statistical point of view. Not even, you know that. So for me, I think even framing it in that lens is not the value added of this project.
What does that mean? I didn't say that.
You would need, there's no question of doing any kind of representative sampling on this. You'd need a huge sample size, which to really get into detecting some kind of interesting, the patterns and the kind of. But an alternative way to get at some of the questions that you had it in one of your slides is, in a way, a kind of purposive sampling. Is actually, I think, would really serve your purposes much better. In a sense that, what can we learn from, and this is related to this idea of thinking of partition as an ongoing process. and also in terms of a revisionist history that needs to be written, is the untold stories of partition. So much of the literature that we read, even a lot of the new empirical work is Punjab focused, which was the main theater of violence. But partition in Sindh has a completely different history. In Bengal, you mentioned partition in Jammu and Kashmir, you see, I think there's a whole history. I'm waiting for someone to write a history of the violence in Jammu that happened. That's outside the scope of your project, but it's those kinds of untold stories beyond just hearing the kinds of, when you played those, it's very nostalgic and very beautiful for me to hear that, but it's probably very familiar to almost all of us sitting in this room, and we need, like, from even the perspective of social science, and there is something for social science to study the partition, so I really commend what you're doing. I think we need to look, what the value added is beyond the sentimentality, and I think there's a lot there. So I don't want to, I'm saying this as someone who's excited and interested, but would encourage you to look at this outside the prisms that we know. So.
Thank you, Rehan. Aarti would like to come here. One question for Tarun is, you hinted at it. If you snowball enough, right, and you get from 400 to 10,000, you hinted at the idea that a snowball sample of 10,000 odd would begin to look representative, most probably, right? With one proviso, Tarun, unless you can cover enough of the poor people, the snowballing could well be very heavily concentrated among the middle classes and above, right?
That's possible.
If the snowballing does not cover the poor, then we will not be able to achieve representativeness even with 10,000. So if there is a way to figure this out, it would be very, very helpful. Aarti, you're next. You also playing something, I think? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm playing two small things.
Yeah.
Should I sit there? Do I have to say something? Or?
You have to just listen.
Okay.
It's if I can figure out what this excellent. Okay. Thank you, Tarun, for that very rich presentation, and Ashu for inviting me to respond. It's particularly apposite that we return to the partition of the Indian subcontinent on its Punjab and Bengal borders today. And these are, of course, stark amputations that presaged and marked the breaks we live with. Kashmir, Chhattisgarh, Northeast India, Balochistan, the Northwest frontier provinces in this part of the world today. It's also resonant that we return to this extraordinary historical and continuing moment of cleavage, and the question of what it means for millions of people to leave home and neighbor and walk across borders and cross seas to an uncertain reception in distant lands. So since we have limited time, I want to begin by saying that this is a absolutely astonishing project, suitably ambitious for a center called the Lakshmi Mittal Center. And while I really hope that this material will be made open to social scientists and other forms of analysis. I, as the only anthropologist here, have to say I'm slightly startled by this torturing of your data. And I want to raise some questions about whether in fact data should be tortured in this way, what it yields. And since we have limited time, I thought I would respond to what we've been offered with some alternative accounts of arrivals and departures, and raise some questions about what it means to collect memory for a view on partition that may be statistically described as negative or positive, since these are not actually descriptions at all. They are value judgments. And and whether what persons felt about who they left behind can be encapsulated as views of the other religion, since we're not sure what other or religion really meant at this time for these people, and whether the problem of history and memory can be accounted for through fine-tuning survey techniques. Now, I'm not saying survey techniques cannot get you somewhere, and I would like to talk about where, as a social scientist who's deeply invested in survey techniques and in other forms of analysis, where I feel that survey techniques can take you, and what kinds of survey techniques can take you there. I'm not sure these are survey techniques that can take you where you want to go. But, so I would love to have a discussion on that. But to begin, let me begin with 5 shares from a ghazal written in July 1985 by a poet living in New Delhi. It begins like this. हम शिकवा करें तो किससे अपने हुए बेगाने, जब दोस्त बने दुश्मन, दुश्मन की खुदा जाने. Before whom would I raise complaint when kin have become strangers, when friends become enemies, may enemies rest in the care of God. किन शोख अदाओं से साकी ने पिलाई है, रिंदों से शिकायत का मखमूर है पैमाना. With the subtle graces of grief the saki pours, the cup is drunk on the accusations of drunkards. शेख जी रिंदों को मस्जिद में ना आने दें, जाहिद की इनायत से आबाद है मैखाना. The sheikh barricades the masjid from the drunkards. The wine houses are flush with the benedictions of the pious, also the partisan. काफिर हो कि मोमीन हो, महखाने यकसा हैं. काफिर हो कि मोमीन हो, महखाने यकसा हैं. साकी की इमामत है, माबूद है पैमाना. The wine houses are the republic of the kafir and the momeen. In the sultanate of the saki, the goblet is a chalice. These words on the subtle griefs, on the subtle styles of grief and the reverence of drunks were written by a little-known Hindu Punjabi Pathan poet, Puran Chand Sethi, a retired colonel in the Indian Army in the wake of the anti-Sikh pogrom in New Delhi. I know this poet's work because he happens to be my grandfather. In days of terror unleashed by the reigning political regime of the Congress party after the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, as he watched the national capital burn, he returned to write on the potent alcohol of accusations and friends he watched die on a different border. In this presentation, we have been given a sense of the movement of people, an idea of the cataclysm of partition through the mass, through data and numbers that give us a sense of the scale of what happened. We have also been given a sense, and this is new, of the material roots of partition. Where did people go? Who did they leave? What did they carry? What did they come to? But we don't have any sense really of the texture of this world, of this time. The partition of India today is represented as the sharing of 2 communities, and these names, Hindus and Muslims, have been used throughout this presentation. But what does it mean to say Hindus, as opposed to Punjabis, Derewalis, Khukhrenis, Saraiki speakers, Sardars, came to India, and Muslims, as opposed to Bohra, Khoja, and Sindhi Muslims fleeing to Karachi, Urdu-speaking people who became Muhajirs, Punjabis fleeing to Lahore, my own subcaste fleeing from the northwest frontier provinces into Delhi, leaving friends who were our own subcastes, but Muslims behind. Who was a Hindu or Muslim at this time? Is there a more complex sense that we can describe the partition not as an event that emerged from pre-existing social identities, but as a prolonged event space and a social and political process that includes Indian nationalism and Pakistani nationalism, the long time that finally culminated in the terror of partition. Partition is an event space that both created these categories, Hindus and Muslims, as abstract identifications for people, in my case, the Urdu, Pashto, Saraiki, and Punjabi-speaking peoples of the northwest frontier provinces, but this happened across the body of the Indian subcontinent, as names given to people who had never before identified themselves in quite this way. And then these names were taken to be the cause of partition. By this, I mean something very simple, so let me state it quite boldly. Before the 1920s, the abstract identifiers, Hindu and Muslim, in their modern incarnations, were not names through which people identified themselves as a primary or even secondary axis of differentiation in subcontinental India, and certainly not in the regions from which his parents and my parents and your parents came. These are very new names in their modern incarnations, and though they have become a frightening index of our current social realities, we should be very careful of using them incautiously, specifically when speaking of partition. How then did people think of their ties and obligations to each other in this moment of radical sundering? So here then is a story of friendship and flight. Sorry, it's just.
This is your grandfather?
Yes, this is my grandpa.
Shall we get someone?
One moment, I can.
It's
No,
buffering, isn't it?
no, it's just
Yeah,
hung.
that.
It seems to have hung.
It's just hung.
Let me try if I can. Yeah.
So when Amin Chand came till Ambala with the family, then Amin Chand went back to Pakistan. Over here you're saying that Ghulam Jabbar looked after the family. Jabbar played an important role. He conveyed the family to the care of another close friend, Amin Chand.
Amin Chand.
Amin.
A-M-I-N.
Amin.
Amin Chand.
Amin Chand.
He was the adjutant of the 22nd Mountain Regiment.
In Peshawar.
And in Peshawar.
Hmm.
And you see, at that time, the communication was almost broken down. And the family had to be evacuated from there. So that regiment was moving.
Right.
So Jabbar took them into a 5th regiment. Swamiji was there, Ravi Khan, Rehu was there, and after we were Ravi, and the Aarti were in the back of the truck.
So they were in Mardan.
They were in Mardan. So सबको बिठा के, and he drove and handed over to Abhijan. So Abhijan said, don't worry, it's not my responsibility. Look after them and take them to India. So that's all.
So Amin Chand travelled with them.
Amin Chand did not travel. Amin Chand was stationed in Peshawar.
So he sent them with the regiment.
He took the family and gave charge to Amin Chand. Jabbar took the family and Jabbar was sharing the bungalow with me in Mardan. Half the bungalow was with me and half the bungalow was with him.
Okay, since we don't have a lot of time.
Can you just summarize what is...
I will. This is an interview with my 95-year-old grandfather, who was a young officer of age 22 in the British Indian Army in 1947. This is an interview some years ago that my brother did with him, in which he describes my grandfather was across the border. This is when he describes how they moved at that time from Mardan to Delhi. Ghulam Jabbar and his wife Farida, and Puran Chand Sethi and his wife Sarla, my grandmother, lived in the same house assigned to them by the British Indian Army. My grandfather and Ghulam Jabbar, his Muslim brother officer, never spoke again. Ghulam Jabbar, who drove a truck to the border with my grandmother on a cot with her newborn son, this is my eldest uncle, went into the Pakistani army. In 1977, Ghulam Jabbar came to India with Farida on an official visit. Puran and Ghulam applied for permission to meet. It was officially denied. So Puran and Sarla went to the airport in New Delhi and stood outside the fence separating the road from the runway. As Ghulam and Farida walked to the plane, they turned and 4 people waved to each other. My grandfather is now 95. I do not know how old Ghulam Jabbar is or whether he is still living. As 2 Muslims sent my kin from their homes in Hindustan to seek their fates in India in 1947, Some 100 years ago, my clans had walked down from the Hindu Kush and were invited into Hindustan to settle in our ancestral village of Kotchai, some miles from Dera Ismail Khan. So I'll end with a story now of arrivals.
जहाँ के ये वहाँ एक था पहले भी रिलीजियस सेक्ट था पहले उधर एक मुस्लिम्स का था and the story goes that when Sethi Keval Ram with his wanderings came round there and wanted like this area and wanted to settle down there, so the previous priest, Muslim priest था उधर Makhdoom. Makhdoom means the person who has been served. खिदमत सर्विस मखदूम मीन्स जिसकी सर्विस की गई है तो इधर नोन एज मखदूम साहब तो उसको पता चला कि ये देखो एक और फकीर आ गया है तो ही डिड नॉट इट तो उसने क्या किया कि एक कटोरा दूध का भर के अप टू द ब्रिम अपने अटेंडेंट को भेजा ये उनको प्रेजेंट कर दो आइडिया ये था कि इस ऑल फुल टू द ब्रिम एक ड्रॉप दूध डालो तो वो बाहर गिर जाएगा you see तो ये भी समझ गया कि भाई उसने कहा कि भाई तू इधर जगह नहीं इधर मत रुक तो कोई और जगह ढूंढ अपनी तो इसने क्या किया कि एक फूल तोड़ के उसके ऊपर टहरा दिया कहा हम मखदूम साहब को प्रेजेंट कर दो तो मखदूम ने देखा वो भी समझ गया कि भाई ये ऐसा वैसा नहीं है ये भी कोई समझदार आदमी है
In today's India, where every Muslim must now prove their love for this land, their bodies torn open so we may see whether they truly belong to the sinews of this land, my grandfather tells a story of my clans, Hindus invited into Hindustan by Muslims. Makhdoom Sahib, the man who could give because he was the receiver of benediction and grace, and Sethi Keval Ram, my clan ancestor, the bearer of Sat, came from a world in which charisma could be shared. Place could be made for flowers to infuse the gift of milk. What has happened to this gift? To conclude, with a joke again on the banks of the Indus, the great river of the northern subcontinent with whose name we all were once identified. Hindustan, the land of those who live on the Indus. Can I play one last joke clip?
This is not a joke, but anyway. Are you playing something?
Sorry, it's just... Sorry, it's just towards the end of the same clip. Never mind. I won't play it in my grandfather's voice. I'll just repeat the joke. Towards the end of this clip, my grandfather reminiscences as a young man swimming in the banks of the Indus. And in the recording, he can be heard telling my brother a small joke that his uncle coined. So let me tell you the joke. एक शख्स नाम दा खोता नदी के किनारे आन खड़ोता. एक शख्स नाम दा खोता नदी किनारे आन खड़ोता. A one, donkey by name, alongside the river came. देख के सकू लुड़दा ओया मारे विच दरिया दे गोता. Seeing towards him the water crept, into the river he upped and leapt. It is unlikely in today's times that the word donkey may safely nestle next to the word Ram, even in the name of a child. The current reality and post-colonial history of our three lands echo, this time appropriately as farce, the joke my grandfather recalls hearing under the banyan trees that cover the samadhi of my clan ancestor invited into Hindustan by a Muslim peer. Like Khota Ram, we have jumped into the river to save ourselves from drowning. Thank you.
Can we all be here? Yeah. on the question of when Hindu and Muslim identities crystallized in undivided India, Aarti, there is a lot of literature.
I know, Ashutosh, but we don't
Hold
agree on the
You-
reading
you-
of that
hold
literature.
on.
So that's
The last time a significant number of Indians, when asked whether they were Hindus or Muslims, said they were both Hindu and Muslim. Right? A very significant number according to the census. As, a matter that has been brought to our statistical attention. We knew this by Ashish Nandi, of all people. That's the statistician in him which brought it. He writes in a qualitative manner now, but he was trained actually as a clinical psychologist with statistician. I taught courses on stats. Is 1911. 1920s riots take place, quite a lot of them, and it is true that you're right to say that until the 1920s, these identities perhaps were not very crystallized.
that's all I said.
But not by the 1940s.
But
But not by the late
question of
1930s,
what the
1940s.
crystallization of these identity means, we have a disagreement on that question. We can talk.
Well,
about
yes, I mean, we
think
certainly
that's-
can.
yes,
To say that partition made Hindu and Muslim identities even more sharply polarized is absolutely correct. But to say that 1930s politics and 1940s politics had not sharply polarized,
That's not what I said.
by a process began then, a process that partition enhanced.
Ashu, that's not what I said. That
Okay,
is not,
1920s,
that is exactly,
you are
that
right
is
to
not
say
what
that
I
in
said.
1920s, these identities were not very clearly polarized.
Yes.
And even as late as 1940s, another statement can be made. This obviously, this is my old research speaking here. It is also true to say that by the 1940s, villages did not have very clear Muslim and Hindu identities, and identities were very hybridized, villages on the whole. And the polarization of Hindu and Muslim identities in rural Punjab on both sides of the border, I'm not sure about Sindh. We don't have enough data on Sindh, so I'm not sure about Sindh. But that rural Punjab getting polarized into Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim identities, not urban, that is to a very large measure the contribution of partition of India.
So that's what I'm saying.
Okay, then we're not
No, but
disagreeing.
I'm saying other.
Then we're not disagreeing. Yeah. So
You're
okay.
hair splitting with me on a question. We will discuss this later, Ashu.
Okay,
We are
all
in
right. Okay,
agreement
okay.
broadly,
Okay, all right.
and I disagree with you more sharply. But that's
Okay,
it.
it's all right. Okay, now we have 25 minutes left. Let's ask our speaker, would you like to take some more questions at this time or want to respond to what you heard?
Yeah, let me respond just in 2 minutes,
Yeah.
2-3 minutes. I mean, thank you to both of you. Really, let me just go in order. Rehan. You know, the idea of, it's interesting, when we started this project, because both Kareem and I are applied math people, I mean, we were meandering into contested territory and emotionally fraught territory. Emotionally fraught even for ourselves as people, but certainly emotionally fraught in scholarly communities. We created a sort of advisory group of eminent historians, including Vazira, who's part of our advisory group. And it was very interesting to me that when we went around, I remember saying on one of these calls, a bunch of people on the call from England and India and Pakistan and so on, saying that I want to do this statistical analysis of emotion and this and that. What convinced me this was a good idea was that the call immediately became sort of an argument between those who thought this was patently absurd and those who thought this was the most refreshing thing ever. And I said, okay, this sounds like exactly the controversial thing I want to do. So anyway, I'll leave you to make what you will of that anecdote. Look, I'm very sensitive to the idea that in doing violence to the data and reducing it to a set of numbers, you lose a lot of information. But I'm not sensitive, I don't take kindly to the idea that exercise cannot be done in a way that is insightful and yields some insight. that should then inform the anthropologists and the political scientists and so on. Be that as it may, that is my intellectual persuasion and my philosophy of doing work, that you observe, that you take a complicated problem and approach it from many lenses. As regards the actual exercise, look, the sampling problem is the elephant in the room. But my hunch is that the thing that'll work, so I looked at a lot of complicated techniques, and I don't think it's not really called, it's sort of like a form of snowball, it's called like referred sampling.
It's a form of snowballing.
It's a form, but it's a particular form that has its own analytics with it. I'm not convinced that'll work. One reason being what you said, that unless you start from a population, but you could do that. I think a simpler thing is just to sample very widely and then correct any statistics that you come up with standard errors that are appropriate to the buckets and pools that you do. Is that perfect? No. But the entire exercise is imperfect, and I think that we have such a data vacuum from the marginalized communities that I'll stake my hat and my reputation on saying that this will be insightful at the end of the day. Because we have zero, therefore almost even the collection of data will be useful. What you saw on the last slide I think is very important, and it crystallized for us after we started doing the first few hundred of these, and we said that, look, we're getting people like us, by and large, and we need to get, the Bohris and the Ahmadis and the Dalits and whatever, and of course the women who we had already seen in the ambassador interview process were generally less likely to speak. So we have to go and get those, and I'm happy to say that we're able to do that. So we're starting to get those voices. There are a lot of other things that both of you said that were really quite spectacular. This issue of when did the identity crystallize? I'm not at all familiar with this literature. I've read Ashu's book from some years ago, but what is that book, that yellow and orange book, Ethnic Conflict?
Civic Life.
Yeah, I read that book many years ago. But that's insightful to me to be reminded of it. And of course I know it from my grandparents. But at the end of the day, in 1947, I'm not splitting hairs with Aarti at all, but in 1947, people had to choose what to do. By and large, had to choose whether they wanted to stay or go. And whether we assign that label as, identity A and B, we call them Hindu or Muslim, the statistics are agnostic to the particular label that we put on it. We may choose to put different interpretations on it. The statistics are agnostic to it. Some people chose to move this side from the border, and some people chose to go the other side of the border. And when we code it with a variable, that's all they're capturing. We're calling it H and M, but so let's open it up.
Yeah, one more thing, Rehan, Ashish Nadi's data I know reasonably well now because I have heard him and I've looked at some of the materials. His interviewees are not remembering a Batwara partition. A lot of we don't have the exact apportionment and exact disaggregation of data into boxes. How many are calling it Batwara? And a lot of them saying Pralay.
Wow.
A lot of them are saying Pralay.
What does that mean? Which language is, which are these? Pralay is like the cataclysm.
Catastrophe.
But these are the Hindu Punjabis.
An immense catastrophe.
These are the Hindu Punjabis calling it.
Yeah, these are not the Muslims.
Yeah, Muslims won't use the term Pralay, right? So these are the Hindu Punjabis called, they don't think of Batwara, right? So I have pushed him a lot on this when I first heard. And I said, do you have numbers on this? And he actually can give you numbers. A very significant number of those 6,000 odd interviewees, mostly in India and Pakistan and only a few from Bangladesh in there, they recall the 47 partition as an immense catastrophe, not a partition, right? So Pralay is the term they keep using.
But his term is still relevant. His
So
point
he
is relevant, which is the partition term is an administrative term, which is a...
Right. No. The point is why are so many people using the term partition at all? If you're saying that, why are so many people using an administrative term as opposed to an experiential term? That is a valid question. Very valid question. But a lot in that, in the largest data set that I have seen so far, this will be larger in the end. But Nandi's data set is talking a very significant, I don't remember now the exact, but a very significant number, recalling it as an immense catastrophe.
But
as
this
prolong.
is just exactly what you're saying right now is just so fascinating and telling about, like, the
Right.
way people are, the terms they're
The
using.
term they
and
use
what
for it, which is a very
connotations.
important question you've raised. What is the term they're using?
Yeah, which is a very
for-
important point because we are referring to ourselves as partition,
Right, right.
So
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to. I have a few more things to say, but let me hold off because I think we should get more participation going. So I think Bhrigu is next.
Thank you, Tarun. Here in our center, we like having interdisciplinary fights. We don't call it dialogue.
You
The
do, you
fictions
don't.
are sometimes interesting, but we like giving whoever visits us some homework. So I just wanted to rephrase a couple of Aarti's propositions because it isn't this, as an anthropologist, fellow anthropologist, it isn't that this is this exotica that we just don't understand big data, but there are some very basic social science things that Aarti is proposing. Right? So when Hindu-Muslim identity is solidified, that's debatable. Each of us may have different whatever we are drawing on for our claim. But one of the things Aarti is proposing that caste the fact that you don't pay attention to it could be a catastrophe of sorts. Because basically, as many anthropologists have argued, the central fact of South Asian Islam, I'm not saying Hinduism, Islam, and myself am trying to write on this with Faisal Devji, who's a great philosopher of Islam in South Asia. The fact if your last name is Siddiqui or Qureshi, Siddiquis are the Brahmins, Qureshis are the so-called Dalits.
Butchers.
So your experience of partition, where you settled, how you moved, how you were reabsorbed will be very different. If your last name is Khanna or Agarwal, as opposed to say Balmiki, whatever, it would be very different. So Aarti is also proposing that the category of Hindu or Muslim may be obfuscating a whole lot of movements that we're just not seeing. So caste being an absent thing is analytically quite problematic. The second thing I think that comes out of what Aarti is saying is that for us as anthropologists, we think a lot about what is an interview. For us, there's no such thing as an open-ended interview, and I don't say it only as an anthropologist, I say it as somebody who's worked now for 2-3 years with psychiatrists, trying to think about how you interview somebody with trauma, how do you interview somebody with schizophrenia, with anxiety disorder, etc., in which there's a lot of attention that has been paid to how a semi-structured conversation might happen. So there's a group at McGill who's designed what they call the McGill Illness Narrative interview schedule. So I'm saying in the realm of protocols that how do you have a standardized interview that 3,000 people you can interview, but whether they can be an open-ended interview, no anthropologist would necessarily say that you can just go and ask people, tell us your story, and that what will emerge may be pure sort of stereotyped lines that people have, which are meaningless in a way. So the issue for us as anthropologists would be what is an open-ended interview. And the last thing is that it could be the case that you're in a very powerful presentation. The thing that's missing from a very social science, political science, economics perspective is what social scientists call here are the alternative explanations. So when you see a few times nobody else has done analysis, that's not at all true. You'd have to take what would be the standard 4 or 5 counter explanations. So Wilkinson, for example.
Of what?
He,
What's the outcome?
Exactly.
That
so
is to be explained.
The question would be that what is it that people have tortured the data to produce? So Wilkinson has produced an interesting proposition that, so it isn't that people have not studied this phenomena and not produced any
Wilkinson has not produced data on partition.
No, that their archive which shows the army thing, that the
There is one
villages-
article on
quite
who killed.
interesting.
Listen to me. I produced one data set with him.
Yes.
The article on partition violence there is on who killed. And the argument is that the biggest killers were those who had a prior military background
That's
and had been decommissioned. Right? That's very different from what's going on here. The outcome to be explained was who killed. That was the so-called dependent variable in that. And there is proper statistical exercise that they have undertaken, which is questioned by some people who study militaries. But that's a different matter. But what is explained is who killed, which is different from what's going on here. Right? So the so-called outcome variable is very different in that.
Being that as it may, the issue of what is it that we are, what is the question we are proposing?
Incidentally, Ashish Nandi would disagree with that, about who killed.
Absolutely.
Whether people with prior military backgrounds and decommissioned, they were the ones who were the biggest killer. So he would disagree with that. But anyway, go ahead.
So on each of the questions that interest you, how did movements take place? How did people relocate? What was the experience? The explanatory background is not as empty.
I didn't say it was empty, I just said that this particular style of analysis is empty. And if it's not, then I'd love to be educated.
Ashu, can I just ask?
Sure.
So I just want to actually raise some practical questions from a social scientist point of view on your interview techniques, for instance. Now, the problem that Rigu is trying to draw attention to and that I share is that it is not as though, Tarun, that statistical forms of analysis, such as the ones you undertake, cannot give us information. They give us enormous amounts of information. I'm arguing that the kind of information you are making them yield cannot be got there through these. Let me give you an example of what I mean. When you, in your interview model, I found it very interesting that you say that when you look at a transcript, you take only the statements of the person being interviewed and do not look either at the statements of the interviewer or at any of the other body and so on. So what you're doing is you're basically taking what is an interaction and making it into a form of evidence that then can be treated as though it was not an interaction. You see what I mean? An anthropologist is interested in how do people recall in the moment of recalling, and because nobody recalls alone. Memory, social memory, certain psychologists and psychoanalysts would say that even individual psychic memories are deeply social. And we don't become people inside our heads, right? We become people in interaction with other people. So that is why anthropologists would never look the same interview, and anthropologists would never treat it in this way because we don't believe that you can actually
But at the same time, the thing I'm proposing is that actually anthropologist Arthur Kleinman at Harvard has helped design a standardized protocol of an open-ended semi-structured.
Yes, I'm aware about this.
So the is designed on his illness narrative model.
Yes.
But so we're equally interested in that if 30 people have to
Of
conduct
course.
the same interview with 3,000 people, what would be the standardized protocol by which they might conduct something like a trauma interview that there is good work on, in which each question has been hugely debated, that are these the order in which the question should be asked, then Arthur says no, you have to first ask.
No, but Rigu, beyond that, the question is rather than seeing this as an interaction, which is what it is, you're trying to extract it to then yield things like, do they view it positively or do they view it negatively?
It would be having, since
That's
I've done
not
lots
possible
of...
to do.
One second.
I mean...
One second. I don't agree with that either.
I don't agree with
I don't
so,
know
so
what
interaction...
does it mean to say positive or negative, Ashu? That's the question I'm asking.
Sorry?
So
what does it mean to stabilize a question? Okay, in which case then, Tarun, I'm asking, what new does it yield? In the sense that you're giving me fairly common sense... The consequence of your data crunching is very common sense, such as the fact that people who were middle class had an easier time of it, and people who had connections had an easier time of it.
That's
now,
fair.
anecdotally...
That's fair.
So-
I didn't say it was surprising. That's what happened to come out of this pilot study.
All right.
But that's different from a critique of what I'm doing.
No, I'm saying that I'm not saying that what you're doing is not valuable. I'm saying that what is being done, like parts of it are extraordinarily valuable.
No, I understand what you're
I'm
saying.
saying it
I
can't
don't
be
agree
made
with
to
it. That's the
yield
problem.
these things.
I don't agree with it. I think, Sure, go ahead.
So,
if you want.
I think another critique of this, what's going on, is that I think we're looking at it from like sitting here as a social scientist thing, but I've seen some of these transcripts and I've heard some of these interviews. I think there's like a sort of infantilization going on of these people, where sometimes they will say themselves that I think that partition was ultimately a positive event. Now, when they say that, right, and there are a semi-structured number of questions in our questionnaire, and that's like the input we get from the interviewer. Now, if the interviewees say that when I was a child, I was only talking to other Hindus and we didn't really talk with other Muslims, that's them saying they're identifying as Hindu or Muslim or XYZ. And that's them saying that this is my view on the partition. So when they said that, we need to give them the agency of making that point and coding that over here. If they're ambiguous or if that information doesn't exist, we will put them as a missing value. But if they said something themselves then it's a disservice if we don't quote it.
So I would just say that, Aarti, I understand what you're saying, I don't agree with it. I mean, at a very simple level, if you were to look at the transcripts and we randomly pick 5 people from this room and said, you take this and tell me whether it sounds like somebody who's really pissed off or somebody who's resigned, I think we'd all agree on that. We would give very, very high, and I can say that in fancier terms. But basically, we would all agree with that, and that would be something that I think merits explanation. The second critique that you're making is that by doing what we did, which is ignoring the intervening questions, that somehow distorts the very data that we're coding, and therefore the patterns are illegitimate. I can see that that's a logically consistent point of view. I don't think I agree with it empirically, but it's a defensible point of view.
Yeah, also, the other point, the point that Raghu is making, that Arthur Kleinman has come up with
Yes.
No, but then you have to establish that interviews today with these people, these are 80-year-old people, they still have trauma inside them. That is not
what he's
that
asking,
is so you look at, once again, since I know Nandi's data set quite well, this is the first time actually I'm hearing you.
Yeah.
So there some of the interviewees in the middle of the interview absolutely broke down.
Yeah. No, so we have
And
to do that.
you're right.
I should
So
just
once
to
again,
clarify.
let's just finish one second. So the wife heard for the first time that the husband described killing someone, right? That this had been suppressed, and in some cases killing quite a few, and this had been suppressed for 50 years. That interviewing began in '97 or something like that, Ashish Nandi's, right? And there were quite a few such examples, right? But a number of people are pretty resigned to what happened. And you said resignation, yeah. And I don't know what the numbers are. And those who are resigned to it, I'm not sure the term trauma applies.
No, but Ashu, just so you're clarified on the method, it isn't that there's a standardized. I'm trying to offer you, we are, as anthropologists, this is not coming as a surprise to us. Both of us do interviews or interact, do fieldwork.
See, I don't think it should be turned into anthropology versus something
No,
else.
no,
I don't think
We're
it should
not
be turned
turning
into
to
that.
anthropology for any reason. This is just social science method. Ashu. You're a social scientist as well.
And just to clarify, it's not that I'm producing, I'm giving you your social science vocabulary. I would say an anthropologist would never say that this is a standardized interview protocol.
Right.
But I'm saying from anthropology, and this is for interviewing people with serious mental, much more than trauma. So it isn't that it's insensitive and you can't deal with people who are crying, etc. I'm saying anthropologists have also asked the question, not only anthropologists, anyone in social
I think it's
science.
very useful.
Did you want to say
something?
I think there's some confusion in what we mean by open-ended interview. These aren't interviews where they just go and say, tell us what you remember of partition. That's not how this is going at all. There is a set of like 7-8 questions which are sort of divided into talking about life before partition, during partition, and after partition. The questions themselves are broad so that it gives freedom to the interviewee to talk about whatever they either want to remember, do remember, or think as important. I mean, that's also often a situation of what do they think was important that they want to talk to you about. And these are done, they are not very long interviews, they're about 45 minutes usually, so they aren't like, they're not being probed beyond a point, but we do give our interviewers sort of follow-up questions that they have an idea of, like if someone talks about we traveled from X to Y and then just don't say anything else, they may probe and ask, did you stay at a refugee camp? And so there are follow-up questions, so it's not, I think there's some
So
mistake.
it's not clear that that the term open-ended then applies.
Exactly, it's open-ended just.
It's semi-structured.
Yeah, it is
The term is semi-structured then, right?
Yeah.
Then it's an interaction, and Aarti is right. It is an interaction then.
It is not survey questions. It is an
Yeah, but
interaction.
however, whether interaction corrupts the data is a different issue.
But this question is not
That
about
is it.
corruption, Ashu. I think we're having a problem wondering, treating. Let me say one last thing.
Yeah.
Again, Tarun, when you are giving us this very interesting analysis where you show us things we really don't know, right? Where did people go? What were the migration routes? What did they carry? What did they leave? Certain forms of statistical analysis can give you a very rich sense of things like this. I'm saying, however, it cannot be made to yield
Subjective
claims on which you stabilize under things like positive or negative. This does not actually help you. It doesn't help you to make the statistics want to yield that. Because how would you, for instance, describe my grandmother's
you're saying,
grandfather's
okay,
relation?
listen, you're saying, Tarun can respond to
Fine.
that.
I mean, if
Tarun
this
can
seems
respond to that.
important,
You're
then I
saying
suppose
when
sure.
someone remembers that it's positive event, you cannot attach stability to that statement that it was positive.
No.
You cannot attach, similarly, you cannot attach stability to a negative assessment.
I'm saying
Right.
that you cannot decide, you cannot have master categories of positive and negative and then read interviews to see whether across all of the many complex ways in which people narrate what happened, how they left, what it means to remember, what it means to talk, to look at that transcript and then ask statistically whether 17% thought it was negative 50 years later or positive. Ashu, I'm not sure what this exercise is for. There are many other interesting questions that this kind of analysis can answer. I'm not sure these are interesting questions to ask it to yield.
I see.
Let me probe it for a second. What if we didn't have these very crude master categories, but we had, for the sake of argument, 10 different relations of outcomes? Would that make you more or less
I
comfortable?
don't know.
Or are you
I'm
intrinsically opposed to the exercise?
Okay, does someone else have an idea? I'm instinctively opposed to
To
making
categorization.
statistics do this.
I think that's what's going on.
I like statistics a lot. I use them. I look.
like it and be opposed to categorization.
No, the question is, what is a technique being used for? At what scale of social analysis
Your
towards
opposition-
what ends?
Right, your opposition is to any form of categorization of this form of.
No, my opposition is to.
Just trying to understand.
Well,
we have questions.
Okay, we have
questions.
let's hear. We have a rule here that we must latest break by 4:10 because we
What is
have
the time?
staffing obligations outside and
Then yes.
governor. These are simple governance rules. So we have we can go easily till 5 after 4, but then we must begin to. This is, you can see, it's a very interesting discussion that's going on. It's also very involved discussion that's going on. So go ahead.
Yeah, I actually wanted to interject on this debate from the perspective of language. So my own work is in 3 different countries and I use translations quite a bit. So I would actually tend towards Aarti's argument. So for example, a word which is there, especially in South Asian languages, words are ambiguous. A word can be positive or negative based on the context. So when the translation is being made,
Yeah, that's a fair point. I agree with that.
you're
Yeah.
like-
No, that's a concern for sure. I agree with you. Yeah. That is a concern. This one I have less problem with.
But that is a
Yeah.
serious concern.
I agree.
That is why I think Aarti's point has weight, that using the data that you have, making judgments of positive and negative are a little bit problematic.
So I think that can, even if let's say we drop that,
that's impressive.
Tarun drops that. Suppose you drop that, it doesn't. There's a lot else that is going on, which can be.
Right.
Yes.
Don't say that particular point, whether you remember it positively or negatively, that can be dropped. There's a lot else going on about.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Fact, I
Yeah.
agree. Like where the refugee camps were, etc. That's very useful.
That's fine.
But
No, that's fine.
don't.
Yeah.
Hi Tarun, could you tell us a little bit about the process through which you framed the questions that you're asking, right?
I'm gonna ask,
why you
Cool.
picked these particular categories, what kind
Which
of literature
categories?
is...
I'm sorry, which on the particular analysis?
in terms of the statistical analysis.
Which categories do you have in mind?
The positive outcomes.
Positive, negative, we have discussed. What else do you think? Which are the categories?
The camp categories, right?
Should-
So why are these paired together? So what kind of literature is he speaking against or with?
What was
in
paired?
order to
What
pick
was
these
paired?
particular-
Let's understand. What was paired?
So the religious categories, the positive and negative outcomes, the camps, those are the
Positive,
three,
negative. Let's
and
drop that
economic
for a moment. Yeah.
statistics.
What else? What categories are we talking about?
She's
Religious
saying,
categories.
Why did I put up the tables I put up? Is what she's asking.
Yeah, like what?
Okay, let's just leave
Yeah.
it at that. So no good reason.
Class,
perfectly
middle
blunt.
class. This is a very interesting category.
That is actually a very interesting.
I would like to
variable.
ask a question about that, but
That's a very interesting variable, but there's no deep answer to what you're saying. I mean, we started collecting the data, and then we began to look at. As I say, I have no other than an emotional interest in this. I have no dog in no bone in this fight, as to whether this happened or that happened, etc. This is purely looking at the transcripts saying what are things that we can reasonably unambiguously code. So this is where I part company from Aarti, where we can reasonably unambiguously code. You can debate whether it's of use or not. You may think it's useless or not useless. And then what correlations can we show just to begin to understand the data. So we're at that phase. We're looking at the data and trying to understand it, both as consumers in a qualitative sense of reading the transcript or of listening to the emotion and the voices, and in my case, of reducing them, if you will, to these crude categories to try to see how else I can understand it. I don't feel the need to defend that. That's just a way of understanding the data as a first step. So there's nothing more than that. And if it turns out that there are analyses out there that have been done, which are the alternative hypotheses that Brigu is talking about, that's wonderful. We'll, work with those as foils and say, can we add to that conversation and say, yes, we sort of agree with this, or we don't agree with it, which is how scholarship proceeds. So.
We don't even have estimates of how many people migrated, actually. We don't have estimates of how many people died.
I mean,
the estimates range, if any statistician who hears this range, from 250,000 to 1.5 million, it's a complete nonsense for him. That's hardly an estimate. With a range like that, it's hardly an estimate. So I think some better statistics would be helpful about these things also.
I mean, I'm going to do one thing that I will find incredibly interesting, which came from the realization that, look, we're only so far sampling on people who look like us, right? That the minute we get some of these sort of communities of people who've not had their voices recorded, I think simply understanding what they see very differently from us, from me, would be incredibly interesting to a variety of different literatures.
I read a proposal once about the exact magnitude of migration, right? I'm not sure what emerged from that. That was actually a Harvard project. I'm not sure what came out of that some 10 years ago at Center for International Affairs. But numbers which is, any estimate which is, so migration numbers, 15 million to 20 million. That's, some would argue 12 million to 20 million. That's not an estimate that can be given a statistical respectability, and better numbers would always be helpful on that. Yes, sir.
So I think in terms of methodology, there's other people who are more qualified. I want to thank you for your presentation. I had some questions about the sampling you use. Specifically, you talked about gender, but I'm wondering about class and the fact that so much of your data seems skewed toward the middle class and upper class.
Yes, I agree.
And I think someone mentioned before the impact of partition was mainly felt by those in the lower class. Related to that, in terms of language, I thought it was a bit strange that most of your interviews are in Urdu, English, or Hindi, as opposed to smaller sub-regional languages like Punjabi. So again, I think I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, and expanding the number of people from those demographics. And then lastly, I was just
Punjabi was not used?
It's there, yeah.
There
are
was
quite
used.
a few Punjabi ones there.
Like
he knows Punjabi and his team knows Punjabi. If you're talking about a kind of Punjabi that is very rural and not urban, yeah.
No, I didn't mean it like that. But I mean
even
in
that I
terms
know.
of villages.
Okay.
But the last thing I had was also why in presenting your statistics you use the smaller numbers, like 19% viewed favorably, when what you're really saying is 81% didn't comment. Or like
is that
other numbers.
No, that's not what I said. What I said is 19 are favorable and 17 are negative, and the others I can't comment. Right?
Oh, okay.
That's more of the flavor of what I'm saying. But the answer to most of your comments are, I agree with you, that one of the realizations after the first couple of months of doing this is exactly what I've said a few times now, that we are getting too much of one kind of thing, and we need to sample another. I agree with you, and you saw on that structured timeline at the end that the ongoing
issue
issues
isn't
are
only
all,
middle class, lower class.
Sorry.
Caste is very crucial as
the caste, I think.
Because
how would you capture it, Biru? Have you thought about it? How would you capture caste? Just
yes,
think
of course. From names, subcastes, I mean,
even among the lower caste, Dalit is also a distraction.
So this has been, when the paper we wrote was the census had asked that, so that was easy for us to do. But the other paper that I was trying to write about castes of businessmen, it's actually from names that you get that.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So and it became hard in South India because South India.
Yeah, but here we have no South.
Because of name, but there is no South India involved here. This is going to be easy. Sethi should probably mean a caste of and subcaste, and it's not too many castes, right? But the problem will be Singh. What is Singh, right? Problem will be that. What does this term Singh mean? And then Sethi might be easier. Agarwal might be easier. Gupta might be easier. But
your point is taken that I agree with.
If you can pick up caste, it would be very interesting. The point that Raghu's made is a very good one here. If you can pick up caste, I don't know how you'll pick it up. Some you will easily pick up, but Singh is almost undecipherable.
Sure, I just wanted to.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on a point Brigu was making, because I mean, actually the question, I mean, which comes up in this conversation of the empirical strategy is fascinating, and it's complex. So which needs to be thought through, and there is some of the most interesting work I've seen, and I mean, last year here in political science, there are all sorts of people working on incredibly loaded topics. We had someone present here last year on rape. Victims' narratives in
during Civil War.
During Civil War. And the really interesting from a social science perspective is actually when you have the value added of having anthropologists come on, where they or even linguists, where they zoom into, because this ultimately this idea of coding is fraud. Is fraud, and would be Aarti would. Someone like Aarti or many people would be very.
Nobody has anything against coding.
Coding, we code our own data.
No.
How do you think we do?
The rape during Civil War.
Absolutely.
Let Rehan finish his point. Let Rehan finish his point. Order. Rehan finish your point.
We are not against coding.
We're not against coding.
So it's okay.
Yeah,
You're not. But the code.
The anthropologists have to now shut up for a moment. Yes.
But how this question of which is the discussions getting to what you code, what you can't code. This is a process, and it requires, for a topic like this particularly, you need to be really attuned to those questions.
Rape during Civil War. The example you gave, the study is a large-end study, incidentally.
Yeah. And
it really runs into hundreds of interviews, and then coding. Once you've done hundreds of interviews, you need to code. And you're right. Coding can be good or bad.
I just want to end on one last thing, which the last discussant said. The other thing is about since you're not going to have a representative sample, thinking about this issue, and there are different ways we've discussed caste here, class, gender. There are all sorts of ways this can be, and this is another really interesting point I think for you. The Citizens Archive of Pakistan, which I'm familiar with, I mean, it's wonderful and I love, but my biggest critique of it is it's an archive of the middle and upper class of Pakistan talking about partition. It has nothing to do with the way the vast majority of people who are the poor of India and Pakistan. So you flippantly said this, go to the Jaipur Literature Festival and we'll do, and I was cringing a little. I was like, that's exactly the empirical strategy someone like you should not be taking, right? You need
point extremely well taken. You remember the snowballing point is precisely that through this you'll get middle class snowballing. But Rehan, how will you pick up narratives of the poor and marginalized on this?
I mean, there are techniques of, either you're going to do it purposively, either you're going to stratify your this is
those
a method
who are poor then.
And then
the question is not those who are poor now. The question is those who are poor then and migrated. That is a very different kind of issue. Statistically.
It's called field work,
Long-range
field
Mr.
work.
Singh, Abhimanyu, last comment is yours.
I want to get out of the statistics, but there is a very famous project that UNESCO undertook.
Yeah.
Which is called the UNESCO Slave Route Project.
What is slave route?
Slave route.
Oh yeah. Oh, interesting.
So I was just mentioning it.
Yeah, it's a good
as
project.
something you might like to look at, because the routes that people took to migrate or flee or escape, I think these can become historical sites.
Yeah, absolutely right. That's a good reference.
With their own narratives and stories.
And I might end with another great UNESCO project, which was conducted in 1951 about memories of partition then and its impact on consciousness, commissioned by Jawaharlal Nehru, who didn't trust the scholars inside because he thought the scholars inside were so corrupted by what happened in 47, objectivity would be hard to get. So he asked UNESCO to step in. Some of those are still not published, but you can get access to them, and I did, and some are published. And that's a great UNESCO project on Hindu-Muslim relations around 1950 and 51. Okay, so this can be in principle interminable, of course, we know that. This is partition project after all. And it's always good to get anthropological questioning of large and social science is always, we're very used to it, and it's very good to get that.
May I
And,
just add that we were
let me-
not questioning the large end. We like large end.
Good.
Nice.
All right. Yeah. So, but it's time to thank Tarun, Aarti, and Rehan for giving us 2.25 hours of remarkably intense discussion. Thank you. Thank you.